Good morning. I'm Matt Leahy. Today is June 23rd, 2015. We're at the University Law School in Concord, New Hampshire, and with the former Attorney General Phil McLaughlin. I was fortunate enough back in 1983 to be hired by Phil right out of law school, and practiced with him until 1997 when he was appointed Attorney General. Today we're going to speak with Phil about his background, his career, and most importantly, the events for his extraordinary term as Attorney General from 1997 to 2002. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning.
Phil, I'd like to talk a little bit briefly about your background. You were born and raised in Nashua?
I was born and raised in Nashua, went to parochial school, graduated from Nashua High School in 1963.
And were a pretty good track and field man, I understand.
In high school, I came to my comeuppance when I got to college and gained a few pounds and slowed down a lot.
Yeah. Where did you go to college?
Holy Cross.
Okay. And after Holy Cross, there was some military service.
It was an interesting time. I graduated in '67, and at that time I had applied to law school, BC and BU. I had applied to the Peace Corps, and I had applied to the Navy. And it was getting into the war in Vietnam. And I was accepted pretty much at each of those places and chose to go in the Navy, and did, and spent ultimately 8 years there, 4 years active duty.
Wow. And what kind of service?
Originally I was on a DE, which was a Soviet sub-hunter, and was a submarine warfare officer, ASW officer on that ship, and then I was an instructor.
And after your military service, you went to law school?
In between, I got a master's in public administration, and then applied to law school when there were people far better qualified than I really didn't think I'd get in, but when I got to BC, they told me that they had deferred in acceptance, something I had no idea about. So I went from being very concerned about that, since I had a little boy at the time, to being a law student. And I was in the Navy at 4 o'clock one afternoon, and I was a student at BC at 9 o'clock the next morning.
Wow. Wow. And so you graduated from BC, and where did you start your law practice?
Laconia, with then County Attorney Dave Decker, who had a civil practice, and I was part of his civil practice for a year. At the end of that year, Mike Murphy, former partner of ours, and I went into a partnership together in Laconia.
After a year, just after a year of practice?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And the firm grew?
It did. It grew to include you, to include Jim Carroll, to include my wife Janice, Bob Hemian. It was a wonderful group of people in my view.
And generally what kind of practice was it?
The office did many, many things. I tended to focus on what I would call simply a small town, northern New Hampshire practice. What would come through the door is what I would do, and typically it would be criminal, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of criminal cases, domestics, torts, and then eventually other things, such as representation of municipalities and governmental entities.
Okay. You were also very active in the community in Laconia.
I was on the city council for 4 years, from 77 to 81, and on the school board for 9 years in the 80s, and I was county attorney for a couple of years, 79 and 80.
Okay. So I want to flash forward to 1997. Life is good, the firm is going well, and you receive a phone call.
I did. You'll remember at the time that you and I employed a woman whose name was Paige Rooney. She was our receptionist. And she buzzed me and said, "There's a lady on the phone who claims to be the governor and wants to speak to you." I mean, those were her words. And I thought it was probably just a woman client who was being funny, so I picked up the phone, and I had never met Governor Shaheen, but I did immediately recognize her voice. It was a short conversation. She asked if she could speak with me and would I go to Concord and chat with her, which I did the next day.
Wow. And how did that go?
Well, I didn't know at the time. I hadn't shown any interest in being Attorney General. I hadn't applied for the job. I didn't know the governor. I didn't know her. I didn't know anybody. I was not politically active in that sense. But we met, and it was a wonderful conversation. And I thought it was interesting, but I expected nothing. The next day, she again called. This time, Paige Rooney knew it was the governor, and the governor offered me the job over the phone.
Wow.
Just that simple. Why? I've never known.
At the time, the governor was talking about appointing someone that would be an independent attorney general. Is that
That was
correct?
in the context of the office at the time, where there was then a public perception that there was too close a relationship between the Attorney General's office and the governor.
Yeah.
So, as I observed it from her perspective, it was good public policy and good politics to speak in terms of appointing somebody who would be independent. And I'm thinking that the fact that she did not know me was probably what drove the call.
Right.
But then again, why me as opposed to somebody else? I've just never known the answer to that question.
But a small firm lawyer north of Concord who was not politically active fit the bill.
Apparently it did. I emphasize that she never explained that to me, and I never asked. I thought if she had wanted me to know what her thinking was, she would have told me.
Right. What was after you became Attorney General, what was your relationship with the governor?
Well, certainly not social. I only had lunch with her on one occasion. She had invited me over because I had done something which she strongly disapproved of. And she looked at me, and I remember sitting there over a tuna sandwich, and she said, when people do what you did, it's either malevolent or just pure political stupidity. She said, I think in your case, I wasn't doing anything from my point of view that was intended to even annoy the governor. We really didn't have much to do with one another in any sense. Our dealings were professional.
Yeah.
She never asked anything of me other than on the first day. And on the first day she said to me, the only thing I'll ever ask of you is to resolve the Maine-New Hampshire boundary dispute, which for me was just an idea at the time. I really didn't know anything about it. But it was
Did you undertake that?
Mm-hmm. I undertook that. I felt that was a responsibility. And the more I understood it, the better I understood New Hampshire's historical claims. And I have to say that, as with repeatedly throughout my 5.5 years there, the activity of the Attorney General's office to me was the activity of the attorneys in the office. Because while I made the commitment, in fact, it was an absolutely superb attorney, Leslie Ludke, who was assigned to represent the state's interest and ultimately argued before the United States Supreme Court. Leslie Ludke became Associate Attorney General while I was there, and just a superb attorney. She did a wonderful job in that case. She amassed a substantial staff, including historians from the University of New Hampshire.
Wow. One of the issues that you inherited as Attorney General was the important issue of education funding and the state's responsibility to provide an adequate education. You were a 9-year member of the school board in Laconia and knew the difficulties with funding education from local property tax. Now you're being asked to defend the state and to say that the obligation to provide the funding shouldn't be an obligation. How do you reconcile that?
I'm hearing that question from a person who was mayor of Laconia for a long time. I think it was somewhat more complicated than that. But to me, it was a case.
Yeah.
As with you, as with me, over all of those years, these are cases. Given the way you presented the question, I'll just remind you that you and I represented numbers of people accused of murder. And we tried first-degree murder cases. I never really personally identified that way, but I was loyal to my clients, as were you.
Yeah.
So I guess I would just default by saying, you're a lawyer, I'm a lawyer. It was the case, I took it, I argued it. I did argue that case in 1997, I think within 3 or 4 months of my being there,
Right.
and could not have done that absent the help of then Deputy Attorney General Steve Horan. He was instrumental in that prep. Argued it against Andy Valinsky. He was supposed to be my professional opponent, and he and I ended up becoming very friendly. I have a lot of regard for him.
Yeah. Year 2000, Supreme Court Clerk Howard Zibbles sent you a memorandum telling you that he had seen something at the Supreme Court that troubled him.
He sent the Chief Justice a memorandum, and the Chief Justice sent Mike Ramsdell as his attorney.
Okay.
Mike had been at the office, had been the head of the homicide group. And I remember vividly, I can remember it as I sit here. I walked around my desk, sat down, he sat down, And he explained that there was this Zibble memo, and he gave it to me, and I read it, and it was breathtaking to think that Howard Zibble, a very reticent person, would present himself as he did. It was clear that there were some serious problems in Howard Zibble's mind, and from my perspective, it was a question of, what do you do about this? So lots of questions. Why are you here, Mike? What do you want? I again appointed individuals in the office to undertake an investigation. Mark Zuckerman comes to mind, now Assistant U.S. Attorney. He and his people did an extremely thorough investigation. And what we did is we took the entirety of the investigation and we put it out in writing. We had a very, very detailed report so that people knew what we had found. And what we had found ultimately was a basis of impeachment of some of the judges and the resignation of Justice Thayer.
No small issue.
It was not a small issue. It was one of those issues where you and I are acculturated to understand what to do in certain classes of cases. And then the question becomes, what do you do when you get a case that you've not been acculturated to?
Right.
Where the issues involve people for whom you have an institutional respect. Right. You don't even know the people personally, but there's a strong and compelling institutional respect, and then there's this accusation of wrongdoing sufficient to compel Howard Zibble to do what he did.
Right.
I've told the story, which is true. I went to a AG's meeting down in Washington, and I never attended a single session. I remember the day of the plenary sessions, getting up very early, having lunch on Capitol Hill, and sitting out for a walk. I never came back till early evening. I just walked and walked and walked and walked and walked, and kept asking myself, what do you do about this? What do you do about this? And the conflicts weren't legal, they were really emotional, because you understood that if you were to tackle this straight on, you wouldn't know where it would go. I finally got to the point in my walk of deciding that my angst over it wasn't the issue. And I suppose I was defaulting to where I came from, and that would be, why would you treat these individuals any differently than you would other individuals? And what would ultimately the public expectation be? It would be to treat people equally as the only just way to do it, which is what I elected to do. And it proved to be very contentious, to say the least.
Right. Another significant issue, the Catholic Church scandal. You raised Roman Catholic in Nashua, attended Holy Cross, and you presented this issue of decades of abuse of children by priests and the cover-up by the leadership.
All of which we know in retrospect. At the time, we didn't know that at all.
Yeah.
At the time, I was reading about the issue in the Boston Globe and called my counterpart down in Massachusetts and asked him for some information, which he gave me, but it was about the Massachusetts issue. So I decided that I needed to make some inquiries in New Hampshire just to see if there were issues. So I called a longtime friend of mine, Ovid LaMontagne, who was representing the diocese. And I had met Ovid in various cases and had a lot of regard for him then and now. And I said to him, can you make some discreet inquiries and let me know if there are any difficulties in New Hampshire that warrant our looking into? Ovid contacted me shortly thereafter and said, no issues whatsoever. There was a headline in the Union Leader very shortly thereafter, because the Union Leader had begun to have an interest in it. And basically it was a headline that says, Attorney General vouches for the diocese, something to that effect. Ovid called me. He said, I've had a contact from the diocese. The information I gave you may not be entirely accurate. And I made some rather remarks to him that were fairly pointed, and told him I thought it would be a real good idea if I had a meeting with the diocesan representative in 20 minutes. And I walked out of my office, got in my car, drove to his office at Divine Millimet, and sat at a round table while he and a diocesan representative came in. And we had a tete-a-tete. And it was apparent to me that the information I had received and relied upon, no problem, was grossly understated. And the diocesan representative took pains to remind me that this was a church-state issue and that they were going to take care of the problem themselves. And I expressed my view that there was a governmental interest that needed to be vindicated. We needed to investigate. We needed to make our own assessments. And at first there was reluctance. There were 2 attorneys in the office whom I appointed to do the special investigation: Will Delker, who's now a Superior Court judge, and Jim Rosenberg, wonderful attorneys. And they did. They undertook an investigation. The rest becomes history. Once again, as with the court, my judgment was that the very best thing to do would be to essentially publish everything we found so that people could decide for themselves. But it ultimately led to this report which demonstrated the breadth of the problem, not just individually with these particular priests, not just with respect to victims, but with respect to the cover-up of the church.
Right.
There was one particular moment I remember, it just symbolizes it for me. Will Delker and Jim Rosenberg came into the office late in the day, well after 5. And they sat there and they were obviously distraught. I remember one of the other of them is just having tear in their eyes. Yeah. And what they said is they had just interviewed 2 young men in their 30s. And these young men had the courage to come forward. But what they said to me is they were so humiliated by it all that they would never forget it. So from that point on, I think it turned for me from being an investigation of a terrible public problem to identifying with the people who were the victims of this, these young men largely, who had relied upon priests. You and I both, being Roman Catholic, understood the meaning of the extraordinary deference that you gave to priests and the violation of that. And these young men were paying that price. Right. That's what sticks with me even today.
Wow. And part of the resolution of it was some safeguards put into place.
Yes, it was plain that we were going to seek indictments. We had convened a grand jury. The church ultimately agreed to acknowledge that we would be able to prove a case, and it agreed that it would allow safeguards focusing on disclosure to be put in place. That's what we did. By that time, Kelly Ayotte had a good deal to do with that, as did Ann Larney.
Going to run through some other, again, significant issues that came up during your term, and the next is tobacco litigation.
The tobacco litigation was just getting underway. There was a Mississippi Attorney General, Mike Moore, who was leading it in Mississippi, and it just broadened so that the National AG's Association took a real interest in it, and that sparked the so-called tobacco litigation. I keep going back to the people in the office, but I associate what was happening there with people in the office. And once again, that was something that Leslie Ludke was assigned to undertake, and eventually Walter Maroney. Both of them, as with all of the attorneys down there, did an absolutely superb job, and ended up having New Hampshire be allocated something in the range of $50 million a year.
Wow.
As part of the settlement. I had naively assumed that the money would be used for the intended purpose. But in New Hampshire, the intended purpose is always to eliminate taxes for people who can pay them. So what they did is put it to the general fund and threw a small amount of money toward taking care of people who had tobacco problems.
Energy deregulation.
Well, that was an extraordinary event. That is the event that I certainly had a large public responsibility for from a public policy point of view. But it was within the office a case that was managed by Attorney Steve Judge, who eventually became Deputy Attorney General, a superb lawyer, and he was authorized by the legislature to hire outside counsel. He hired counsel from Boston. He was intimately involved in that on a daily basis for way over a year. I was briefed on it, if not daily, very frequently. But I have to say, I never understood the technical issues the way that Steve Judge did. Right. And I didn't understand the political issues the way then Representative Jeb Bradley did,
Right.
or certainly the way the Governor Shaheen did.
Right.
I remember being amazed at conversations, typically in our corner office, about various scenarios to resolve the issue. And each of them, of course, had to do with money flows. I came away saying to somebody one day that Governor Shaheen had a mind like a calculus.
Right.
She seemed to be able to sit there and do these equations in her head. And I just had never met anybody with the capacity to do that.
Right.
She's obviously no longer our governor, but I'll tell you that she was as smart a human being as I ever met.
And you've spoken highly of her counsel, Judy Reardon, as well.
Judy Reardon, who was the governor's right hand, had an extraordinary control over a wider range of issues. She and Rich Siegel. But Judy Reardon is the person that was my most frequent interface with the governor's office.
Yeah.
A remarkable human being,
Yeah.
and an extremely bright person.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Just remarkable.
Wow. The Elliott Hospital, CMC, Catholic Medical Center merger.
Oh, that was a rush. The Pope would love this. I'm thinking of Pope Francis, who's been of late opining about the role of money in society. And of course, this was an effort by a company to take over what ultimately was CMC, the proposed merger of CMC and Elliott. CMC, of course, was the result of the merger between Notre Dame Hospital in Manchester and a hospital over on the east side, which had been operated by Irish nuns. So it was the Irish and the French-Canadian communities of Manchester that put those two hospitals together that eventually became CMC. And if you were to go back to the 50s and the 60s, you'd understand that Manchester was a very ethnic city. There was a concept over on the west side of Manchester known as la survivance, l'église, l'école. It was the Catholic Church and its outreach social missions. And those hospitals existed because of the dimes and quarters of the Catholic community of Manchester. Mm-hmm. These were charitable institutions. Somebody decided they were simply going to take them over for the greater good of whatever. And I opposed that. Leslie Ludke, once again, was instrumental in that opposition. And the proposal ultimately did not go through. And the hospitals to this day, while they have some affiliations that I hope are helpful to them, remain independent entities.
Turn to the criminal front. In New Hampshire, the Attorney General prosecutes all homicides, and it seems like your term was a particularly violent one, starting right in the summer of 1997 with a guy named Carl Drager.
It didn't start with Carl Drager.
Okay.
I think I was appointed Attorney General effective May 18th, 97. My recollection is that it was July 3rd, 4th, or 5th, when a little girl, a 5-year-old named Elizabeth Knapp, was raped and murdered just west of Concord. And originally, we focused on a man named Richard Buchanan. And I remember that there were clamors for the death penalty for Mr. Buchanan. I even had a visit from a high-ranking state senator who didn't restrain himself in terms of pounding on my desk and telling me that we should bring capital murder charges and have this man executed. And I remember my reticence being, I don't know how I expressed it to him, but that I was not convinced that he did it, but we didn't want to let that stand in the way of fury. Ultimately, despite eyewitness testimony fingering Mr. Buchanan, that man did this. He didn't. And ultimately, a man named Dale was arrested, prosecuted.
Wow.
It was a little over a month later, in mid-August, that there was a call that came to me from Commissioner Flynn, and Mike Ramsdell and I and Commissioner Flynn and John Bothamus, then the colonel of the state police, got in 2 different helicopters out here at the airport, flew to Colebrook. Beautiful day. I remember flying in, and I remember off on the right there was a tarp over what I assumed at the time was Trooper Kevin Phillips. And there was a tarp over a police car, Leslie Lord. And we landed. matter of paying respects, I suppose, but just viewed both of these slain officers. At that time, no one knew where Drago was. Drago was the person who had then gotten into Philip's car, put his hat on, was driving around, went downtown and murdered Judge Bunnell and Mr. Jose, Victor Jose. I remember seeing Judge Bunnell's body out in that parking lot just behind the office, within 30 feet of the office, the newspaper office. And no one knew where Drago was. And that was a long, long day. It was about a week later that Officer Sharon was killed down in Epsom. Yeah, and that was all in the July and August of 1997.
Wow.
It was startling to people in the state. It was startling to the police in the state. It was startling to everybody. It was startling.
I think you've told me that perhaps during your term there were some 80
murders, I think, during that term.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I want to talk a bit about your management style, and it's obvious from hearing your comments up to this point that you give a lot of credit to your staff and so forth. And I want to read a comment that was a quote from a guy named Bob Carey that had worked in your office, an attorney. I was on a case with Bob with co-defendants about a year ago, and we were talking about you, and this is what he said. People in the office would have gone through a brick wall for Phil McLaughlin. That was his quote. I'd like you to talk about what it is that allows you to motivate people like that, and perhaps your experience as a Navy officer, how that may have played a role in it.
I have to say, neither then nor now do I consider anything there special. I just don't. I was brought up in a really parochial setting. I mean, my world was St. Patrick's Church. This was a time when, I remember when the first television came in to my neighborhood in 1950, so that was your world. Holy Cross was an expansion of my world. The Navy was an expansion of my world. And in the Navy, where as a very young man, you have significant responsibility, and you're a naval officer in charge of people 3 or 4 years younger than you are. And I paid a lot of attention to how people who seemed to do well did it. And it really came down to just a human factor. And that was that those officers who had the capacity, the emotional capacity to respect the people that worked for them, were respected in return. It didn't start with the enlisted people. It started with you. And I know my sons who are Marine officers have said the same thing, that if you have it within you to respect people, and if that's the perception, that they will respect you. What I chose to do when I was Attorney General, I think beginning on the very first day, rather than walking from the parking lot to my office, I walked into the building in the back. I went down to the basement, and I first said hello to Ellen Webb, who was affectionately known as Conan the Librarian. She was a superb person. And she would walk out and she would salute and she would say, "Mon General."
Oh my God.
It was silly. But she did this for 5 years. And she would open a door and I would go through to the next office, which was staffed by the person who ran the printing facility, Irene Mahan. And she would greet me. And David Drew, who's no longer with us, would greet me. And I'd go up through the corridors and say hello to people and ask them about their cases and eventually get to my office. But my goal wasn't to go to my office. My goal was to be there and take responsibility for that office and to recognize that the office ran not because of me. It ran because of the various people whom I've mentioned up to this point. Wonderful people. Comes to mind Mark Thompson, who was the office manager, not an attorney, did all the budgeting, managed the grants that came into the state. Sandy Matheson, who was head of victim witness.
Long time.
Oh, a long time. And then these extraordinary people throughout the office who just did wonderful jobs. Jen Patterson, Mike Walls, in environmental. Wonderful people. I'm thinking right now of 3 women who worked in the civil division. Sue Gorman, Sue Lehman, Nancy Smith, Ann Larney. I mean, these are just superb attorneys, wonderful people.
Yeah. Now, 3 of the young attorneys that served under you went on to higher office, judgeships, senator.
Kelly Ayotte was hired because she was a superb lawyer and had done a wonderful professional job as defending in a case out of Hudson, New Hampshire, involving a horrible situation. She was just a diligent person, a hard worker, extremely easy to deal with, very low maintenance human being who just did a superb job.
Right,
Yeah, I count her a friend, definitely from the opposite political party. I'm not sure we share much in common that way. It had no bearing whatsoever on our relationship.
Yeah.
And Will Delker went on to be a Superior Court judge. Steve Horan, the Deputy AG, went on to be a Superior Court judge. John Kissinger, Superior Court judge. Joe LaPlante, federal judge. John Kakavas, U.S. Attorney.
Wow.
These were superb attorneys. Absolutely superb attorneys. It's no wonder that the tenure went reasonably well. How could it not with those people around?
Yep. You undertook to create some gender equity balance within the office during your term?
Yeah, I found when I got there that the management of the office was top-heavy with men, and there were some people there who were performing in extraordinary ways. Thus, Jen Patterson into environmental. Leslie Ledke was made an associate. Kelly Ayotte became head of homicide. Ann Rice assumed an extremely important role with respect to appeals, and it went on and on.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I was very, very pleased to be able to do that. But by the same token, although I was happy to do it, every single promotion was meritorious.
Wow.
That was the point.
Yeah. You undertook some legislative initiatives during your term.
Ultimately, 2. I remember when I went down there, Ray Burton, who was the governor's counselor from the 1st District, spoke to me. And he actually spoke to me close to 100 times over those years. I've commented that if the governor's counselors wanted something from the Attorney General's office, they'd give me a call. And if I had 100 calls, 95 of them were from Ray Burton. 95 of them.
Yeah.
And it would always be the same. He'd never ask for anything in particular. It would be, Phil, how are you? How are the kids? I'll go on from there. He said, I have a constituent, and a constituent just needs to have attention to the case. That's all I ask, and they have attention. But he said to me, stay away from the politics. So I thought that was good advice at the time, and since I was not there for political reasons, I found that easy to follow. There were 2 exceptions. I then and now have a strong commitment to what I think you would generically call civil rights. And I felt that the state of New Hampshire should have an active presence and have the capacity to enforce civil rights violations. So I tasked a group of people, Win Arnold, Gann Larney, Mike Walls, to draft a statute that ultimately was adopted by the legislature and exists as the New Hampshire Civil Rights Act, 354B. And I have to say that if it were not for Donna Sitek, the Speaker of the House, that would never have passed. Wow. Because there was a generalized consensus, political consensus, that New Hampshire did not need any such thing. I felt strongly that New Hampshire did need such a thing and did it. And then one day I had a conversation with a doctor friend of mine, and I remarked on the very hard death of a friend and asked her, I suppose somewhat accusingly in terms of my tone, why did she have to have such a hard death? And she replied in a way that took me up short. I just didn't expect it. She said, well, because of people like you. Some of my colleagues are afraid of prosecutors. They're afraid that if they administer just palliative medicine and someone dies, they'll be accused of overdosing. I was stunned by that. And I know this person so well. I knew she was sincere and decided that that just couldn't be the case. But from her point of view, it wasn't a matter of relying on one prosecutor or another. It was a question of what the law is. So I undertook to change the law and propose changes, and the proposed change came to life with 318B 10 Roman 9, which says that if a doctor makes a choice to provide palliative care and a person dies, then the presumption is that the doctor has acted for good medical reasons.
Oh, that's good.
Those are my only two legislative initiatives, and they could not have occurred without the assistance of legislative leadership.
Okay. The last issue I'd like to talk about is perhaps the most critical one, especially right now, as New Hampshire attempts to execute its first citizen since the 1930s, and that's the death penalty. And you've told us that you've served both as a criminal defense lawyer, handling first-degree murder cases, and obviously as a prosecutor, both as county attorney and attorney general. And that early in your term, you were confronted with two cases that had death penalty implications. The Knapp case and the Sharon case. What I'd like you to talk about is if it has evolved, how your opinion about that has evolved, pre-Attorney General, early Attorney General, and perhaps later on in your term, as you dealt with the issue as the person in the position of responsibility on this very important issue.
Well, I think the way you framed the question reflects a sequence of thinking. When I became Attorney General, I was not opposed to the death penalty. I understood my responsibility. I undertook it. I did not hesitate to bring capital charges in the case of the death of Officer Jeremy Sharon. But sometimes you have to ask the question, not what do you believe, but why do you believe it? I have, as do all of us, sets of belief, but they're frequently rooted in just ordinary social, cultural expectations, who you are, where you're born, what people believe in general. And I believe in general that, as I've heard some Republican senators say of late, there are certain crimes so heinous that the death penalty should be reserved for them. That was certainly my view. But there are other things that you think about deeply. If you were to quantify it, you could say, well, yes, I've thought for 5 seconds and that's what I think. But then when you think about it for an hour, or you begin to actually have experience with it, and can form some basis to analyze a situation based upon careful thought and experience, what was that experience and how did it impact? One of the things I've said to people is that during those 5.5 years, there were many murder cases. And on the whole, they would be reported. The public would expect that you would diligently investigate, that you would arrest if you could, prosecute. And the public did not have a large and noisy emotional response to these cases. They were managed the way all our cases are. So you were able to behave professionally. There was not a clamor to do something other than do justice. When these cases came along that implicated the death penalty, you had constituencies on both sides that undoubtedly were motivated by belief, but their beliefs were associated with extraordinary emotion. So that on the one hand, I would have, as with that state senator I mentioned, people who were unguarded about yelling and screaming and demanding justice as they saw it. Kill him. And on the other hand, I was on several occasions contacted by Irish Catholic nuns, Sisters of Mercy, who told me that I was a good Irish Catholic boy, I knew the position of the church, and surely I would do the right thing. And from their point of view, I wouldn't do something. And they were passionate about that. And on both sides, absolutely sincere. But the point I'm making is that these cases were not managed in a routine way. All of a sudden, a state which would think of itself as not having put any pressure on prosecutors was putting enormous pressure to do what they wanted to be done. Mm-hmm. And my default was always, why don't we take a look at the evidence? Why don't we see what this evidence is? Because your fury is a poor substitute for evidence. How can you assure a just result if you're that angry about something? Right. How can that be done? Right. So actually there were more than 2 cases. There were several different cases, but they never reached public notice. And there came a time when I just began to dread it And it wasn't for any emotional response on my part. It was because I was concerned that if there were a public clamor, then it would impact the capacity of the office to act professionally. There would be these other voices. I've described it like being inside a drum and having people pound on the drum when normally there's no sound inside the drum. In any event, people behaved differently when we were involved with these cases, just very differently. Particularly, I'm thinking the one about Officer Sharon. We had arrested 2 people. Both of them were plainly capable of shooting policemen. I mean, one of them was going up 93, heading north in the southbound lane, firing at a policeman who was pursuing him. That same young man allegedly stated to a cellmate that it was he, not the other fellow, Gordon Perry, who had shot Officer Sharon. That information was not released, contrary to a specific court order. It's exculpatory. And some 60 or 90 days later, when it was released, Judge Netto at the time, not Tina Netto, her dad, Joe Netto, took the view that we had behaved improperly, and he excoriated us for that in a judicial opinion. Wow. And from my perspective at that point, it put in question this issue of who did this. Was it Paul or was it Perry? And I didn't know who did it. I had strong suspicion, but you don't pursue these things based upon some suspicion. In any event, Perry pled guilty, was given life without parole, and that set off a public furor. It led, after I was Attorney General, to an invitation to become part of a commission appointed by Governor Lynch to examine the death penalty. Judge Walter Murphy was the chair of it. Yeah. And I remarked in my written statement that it was wise that I was asked to think about it carefully, because I was still pretty forcefully supporter of the concept, had once advocated for its expansion. But then something happened. Something happened during that time frame, and that is Police Officer Briggs was shot by Michael Addison. Something contemporaneously was happening, and that is a man named Brooks was also being tried for capital murder. Brooks was a white man, very wealthy, had hired others to assist him in murdering somebody for hire, and he is tried, convicted of capital murder, and given life without parole. And 30 days later, Michael Addison, who was a grossly culturally deprived kid from Roxbury, Dorchester, who acted, as I understand the evidence, extremely quickly, spontaneously, turned and shot Officer Briggs. Horrible loss. The young black man is tried. The prosecutors did their jobs. I'm sure the jury's perception was it did its job, but the young black man is sentenced to death. And I have to say, for me, that was the last straw. I'm thinking that lots of people in the state of New Hampshire probably think of the state of New Hampshire as a place where race wouldn't matter. I've never believed that. I think race matters, period. Yeah. And I think that we have, in many instances, cultural amnesia about what that means. And to me, if you're going to have a system that's going to have public respect, then you need to have consistent results and consistent standards. And we don't have consistent standards because we give the jury the right to decide. And there we did not have a consistent result. From my point of view, at a moral level, if anybody deserved the death penalty, it would have been Mr. Brooks. If anybody deserved to have people appreciate the fact of where he came from, it would be this street kid, Addison. But that did not happen. And that changed me. Yeah. It just changed me. We cannot have those kinds of results. I said to a Republican state senator a couple of years ago, I made an argument to him, and I heard the argument repeated when he explained his change of vote. He said to the public, this isn't just a political decision. I need to be able to explain to my grandchildren why it is I would vote for this death penalty. And when they look back at me and hear my explanation, I have to see respect in their eyes. The way this system works in New Hampshire today, I don't think it's going to get that kind of respect. When the New Hampshire State Supreme Court undertook its most recent Addison decision and decided to compare the results in the Addison case to cases nationwide, and found that nationwide the killing of a police officer frequently resulted in the death penalty. I know why they did that. That, from their perspective, was probably pristine law. And I thought it completely missed the point. They had an opportunity to do something meaningful, and that is to compare the result in Addison with the result that had occurred in John Brooks' case 30 days before. Now, that would have been meaningful. That would have made a statement. And from my perspective, the decision was just a wrong decision. But at the end of the day, I think the Supreme Court applied what it understood to be the law. If there's going to be a change, the change should not come about, in my view, because of any Supreme Court decision. It should come about because of the decision of the people of this state in the legislature. And 2 years ago, that came within one vote. And I hope that 2 years from now, we will simply decide that we cannot take those risks. We cannot take that imbued racism and do what we did in this particular case. That's not for the benefit of Michael Addison. It's for the benefit of everybody in this state, and it's for the benefit of the adults who want to look at their grandchildren someday and see respect when they explain their vote. So I'm listening to my voice, and I'm hearing it get a little bit animated, which explains to you the fact that it's a very important issue, as I see it.
Your term ended in the end of 2002, and you returned to small-town practice in Laconia.
Not quite. My term ended on December 18th, 2002, about a month before the governor's. She had asked me to stay on. I was a holdover appointment. And the fact of the matter is, I really didn't return immediately. The fact of the matter is, right after New Year's, I traveled out to Marine Corps base at 29 Palms, California, to spend a few days with my son before he was shipped to Iraq. You'll remember that both of my sons were in the Pentagon in 9/11. Tim actually outside ran in, tried to find his brother.
Tim was at the Pentagon.
At the Pentagon. Tim was sent out within 10 days and went to armor school at Fort Knox. Amongst all the officers there, graduated first in his class. And my son Tim was a Russian scholar and one of the easiest going people you'll ever meet. As a Marine, was an absolute warrior. And given the fact that he graduated number one, they gave him his choice. He chose a forward deploying unit. We folded his flag. I gave him a hug. I went over and met 4 of the gunnery sergeants who were going over with him, and I remember Gunny Johnson said to me, "Don't worry, Mr. Mack, we'll take good care of him." I believe Gunny Johnson was killed.
Wow.
Gunny Popovich was blind. Tim got to Baghdad and his flag went up on the statue. What I'm saying is, between December 18th and May of that year, I didn't do anything. I didn't practice law. I simply dealt with my family, my situation, and truly believed I'd never see my son again. It's that simple. And when he did, it was a blessing. And thereafter, I began practicing law again. And have been in Laconia, and my practice has been essentially the same as it was when you and I were together.
Let's we'll end with your family, because it obviously is very important to you. There's 3 lawyers in the family.
Well, my wife, who went to law school so that we could put our kids through school, and did. St. A's, Holy Cross, University of Rochester, Vassar and Bates, along with the help of a Marine Corps scholarship. And my son Tim currently practices law in Concord with Shaheen Gordon. Matt retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps and now works for the Marine Corps as a civilian. He is, I think, the deputy director of Marine Corps trademarks. Emily is assistant county attorney in Carroll County as we sit here today. Kate, her twin sister, went to Bates and got her master's degree in education at American University. And my son Phillip Daniel, who went to St. Anselm's, is a police officer in Meredith. And I have to say, absolutely loves that job. He's a good policeman.
Like his grandfather.
Like his grandfather and like his great-grandfather.
Wow.
Both of whom were Nashua cops.
Wow.
And who, it's interesting because I think it pertains to my son. they were well respected.
Yeah.
And I think it's because they knew their duty, but they respected the people they were dealing with. And that included the people they were arresting.
Yeah.
They're not judge and jury. They're policemen.
Yeah. You're winding down your practice and will be retiring at the end of the year.
Yeah, I've got another 10, 15 cases I need to deal with. Probably deal with them before the end of the year or the early part of 2016. And then I'm going to spend a lot of time with my grandchildren and do a lot of reading. Got numbers of topics that just fascinate me, and I'll do a lot of reading on those topics.
Thanks for hiring me, and thank you for being my mentor and teacher. And as I tell a lot of people, I should have paid you for the education you gave me, and I mean that.
As I tell a lot of people, you're one of the best lawyers I know.
Good.